Something unusual and powerful is unfolding in Burkina Faso, something much deeper than just another failed coup. After the attempt to take over the government fell apart, the country didn't fall quiet. It came alive. The streets of every major city filled with people, not because they were told to, but because they had something to say. It wasn't chaos, it was clarity. From the capital to the smallest villages, people didn't show up in fear, they showed up with purpose. They didn't come for speeches or favors. They came to protect what they believed in: their land, their dignity, and their future. But what exactly sparked this powerful wave of resistance? And why are so many saying this could mark the beginning of a new chapter for West Africa? This wasn't a protest looking for permission. It was a warning. Messages painted on walls and carried on signs said it all. Burkina is not for sale. No to France. Traitors will be exposed. These weren't cries for help. They were clear signals from a people ready to defend their home. The air was serious, almost sacred. There were no party slogans or empty cheer. Protesters walked side by side, some humming old revolutionary songs from the time of Thomas Sankara. The young stood with the elderly. Ex-soldiers walked with mothers from the markets. Kids carried handmade flags. Everyone had a role to play, and they all moved with one clear goal: to show the world that this time they were fully awake and would not go back to sleep. Some guarded the crowds. Others passed around water. But the real message wasn't about peace and calm. It was about drawing a line that must never be crossed again. This wasn't only about the coup. It was about calling out the forces behind it, those hiding in embassies, pushing quiet agendas, and using soft words while pulling hard strings. The anger wasn't just directed at local traitors. People were pointing fingers at ECOWAS, now seen by many as a mouthpiece for the elite, and at France, whose influence still hangs heavy in the region. But beneath the frustration, something more powerful was taking root: a strong belief in self-rule. These crowds weren't just standing up for Traoré, they were standing up for the right to choose their own path. The coup may have failed, but to many, it was just the spark. The real movement was in the streets, a movement not for power, but for identity. Young people who had grown up hearing about Sankara, but never seeing his dream brought to life, were now stepping up to carry that vision forward. They weren't naive. They knew how leaders who challenged Western interests often ended up. They'd read the history books that praised colonizers and buried African heroes. They understood how debt was disguised as aid, how coups were supported behind closed doors, and how foreign NGOs often had hidden agendas. And still, they marched. They didn't come out expecting quick victory. They came because giving up was not an option. New symbols appeared. Red lines painted across faces to show the blood already spilled for freedom. Children held signs that read, "I won't be a slave." Young men held stones not to throw, but to show they would stand their ground. Their flags weren't perfect. They were stitched, dirty, and sweaty, just like the people who carried them. These weren't props. They were shields. Perhaps the most striking thing was how peaceful it all was. There were no mobs, no political showboating. Just a quiet strength. A collective voice rising not from fear, but from something far deeper. It felt like the land itself was speaking through its people, reminding the world that Burkina Faso is more than a name on a map. Despite the pressure, the spirit of freedom was still alive. To the West, it was a warning. To the people, it was an awakening. This wasn't a protest to be dismissed. The message was simple. We are not afraid. We are not weak. And we are not turning back. They weren't just walking through the streets. They were reclaiming them. But the street was only the beginning. Beyond the signs and chants, something more organized was already forming. If the crowds were the body of this resistance, the internet was its brain. Online, people were building a second front quietly, strategically, and fast. Messages were encrypted. Memes carried meaning. Digital maps and secure chats moved faster than any government could track. The revolution wasn't just happening in the streets of Burkina Faso. It was being coordinated in real time, across borders, through screens and code. A new wave of young activists in Burkina Faso is leading a movement with the precision of military strategists, even though they've never held official power. These are digitally smart, historically aware Burkinabe youth who aren't hiding in the forests. They've grown up on Sankara's legacy, YouTube tutorials, and online activism. They're not just marching, they're waging a cyber campaign. The street is just one of their battlefields. Their real strength lies in live streams, group chats, and comment sections. They're not carrying guns, but using voice notes, videos, symbols, and viral content to make their mark. Everything is carefully organized. Protest plans happen through encrypted apps like Signal and Telegram, not just for directions, but as digital control centers. Some groups monitor police checkpoints, while others track the movements of suspected disruptors. Tech-savvy protesters even hacked cheap drones to film aerial views of marches and watch security forces in real time. They used quiet signals too. Protesters wore different colored threads to identify roles: red for legal helpers, yellow for medics, and green for community defenders. What looked like fashion was really a secret system of trust and purpose. A simple triangle with 3 dots, chalked onto walls in Ouagadougou, became a quiet symbol, a sign that the place was safe to rest, get food, or charge a phone. No announcements. It just spread by word of mouth. Some protesters even used a form of sign language developed earlier in youth networks, taught through student unions, sports teams, and music groups. The online fight was just as sharp. One digital team focused only on debunking fake news. If global media painted the protests as violent or blindly loyal to the government, they fired back fast with unedited videos, proof, and corrections, sometimes within minutes. They didn't ask for a platform. They created their own. These youth weren't just emotional, they were informed. They used facts to fight back. Some posted memes showing Macron talking about democracy while French troops operated in Mali. Others exposed conflicting statements from diplomats and NGOs, backing it up with funding trails and leaked files. In Burkina Faso, social media became a court of the people where screenshots mattered. When the government called for citizens to watch out for coup plotters, the internet crowd went a step further. They didn't release names but shared suspicious vehicle types, phone numbers, and other warning signs. None of it would stand up in court. But on the streets, it became truth. Online maps marked safe zones, risky areas, and places to avoid. Some even turned mobile games into training tools in case another coup happened. But the biggest shift wasn't digital, it was psychological. In this encrypted space, fear faded. People stopped feeling small or isolated. Every phone became a tool for change. Every group chat turned into a base of resistance. From students to DJs to coders, young people connected across the country and beyond. That's why this movement couldn't be crushed. You can shut down a street, but not a Wi-Fi signal. You can arrest a protest leader, but not a viral post. The movement had already spread through servers and minds, and there's no switch to turn that off. None of this happened by chance. It was built from experience. After years of being watched, misled, and manipulated by institutions that claim to offer peace while doing the opposite, people stopped waiting for change and built their own systems, not with buildings, but with data and trust. For outsiders watching, this shift from physical protests to digital power might be the most unsettling part. You can silence a person, but how do you silence an idea that spreads faster than sound? The protests in Burkina Faso weren't just seen. They were shared by people taking control of their own story. And as the movement grew online, a quieter, more symbolic layer began to emerge, whispering truth even louder than shouts ever could. There were names people were too afraid to say out loud, names that traveled quietly through the streets alongside the voices of the people. They called it the blacklist, or la liste noire. Nobody knew who created it. It was never printed or made public. But still, everyone seemed to know someone who was supposedly on it. These weren't criminals or thieves. These were well-known figures, journalists, lawyers, activists, NGO workers, and even some government officials. People who once held power were now spoken about in whispers, like cautionary tales. Officially, the government denied having such a list. But rumors spread about a silent partnership between loyal soldiers, local informants, and young civilians determined to protect the revolution from within. To them, the recent coup attempt wasn't just a one-time event. It was a warning sign, and they believed that unless the traitors were found and removed, it could happen again. So, a quiet search began, not with trials or press statements, but with silence, disappearances, and watching. The first signs were subtle. A popular blogger critical of the protests vanished from the internet. A university professor resigned without explanation after missing a few classes. A community leader connected to a foreign-backed NGO reportedly left the country under pressure from anonymous youth groups. No one admitted to anything. But the silence was loud. What made the blacklist so scary was that, unlike the protests that shouted in public, this list worked in the shadows. In a country exhausted by years of coups and foreign interference, silence could feel as loud as a scream. When someone disappeared, people didn't ask, "Where did they go?" They asked, "Who told on them?" In the areas where the protests were strongest, staying neutral started to look like betrayal. Some even said the list didn't need names, just suspicious behavior. A serious face in a group photo, a deleted post online, or even saying nothing at all could make you a target. Some feared the list. Others praised it. They saw it as long overdue justice. For years, they believed that elites with African faces but foreign loyalties had sold out the country's independence. "We don't need courtrooms," said one protester. "The West never gave us trials. They gave us bullets. Now, we're speaking their language." This created a dangerous mix of hope and fear. The people wanted to clean out corruption, but they didn't realize how deep it ran. Some youth groups that once organized peaceful marches were now patrolling their own neighborhoods. They tracked who showed up at political meetings. They watched for unfamiliar cars. Some even started confronting people they believed were spying for ECOWAS or France. It hadn't turned violent yet, but it was close. Your reputation, once something to be proud of, was now tied to your safety. In some areas, new systems of justice were quietly taking shape, based not on the law, but on loyalty. Meanwhile, the military kept quiet. They didn't confirm or deny anything. When asked, they just spoke about staying alert and keeping the country clean. They were careful. Admitting too much could fuel fear. Denying too much might make their supporters lose trust. But the people didn't need official proof. Most had already made up their minds. For many, the blacklist wasn't seen as a threat. It was a shield. It was a way to protect what they were building, a way to stop their movement from being corrupted, like so many before it. If certain names had to disappear to keep the revolution alive, many believed it was a price worth paying. But not everyone agreed. From exile, some journalists, opposition figures, and members of the Burkinabe diaspora began to raise concerns. They warned that while the movement had begun with noble goals, it was now walking a fine line, risking justice turning into control, and possibly losing allies in the name of hunting enemies. They feared the revolution could become the very thing it stood against. Still, those voices came from far away. On the ground, surrounded by the scent of burned tires and the sound of angry chants, the choice seemed clear to many. Better to lose a few now than to lose the whole country later. Whether the list existed on paper or not, it was real living in people's stares, whispers, and watchful silence. In a place that had seen betrayal too many times, the fear of future treason felt like reason enough to act first. Some people focused on enemies inside the country. Others watched larger forces gathering just outside the borders. From Paris to Washington, Abuja to Brussels, the reaction was the same: silence. But it wasn't due to apathy, it was calculated. These weren't the usual protests that begged for outside help. They were open declarations of independence, broadcast in real time by people with no official titles and no elite backing, just raw determination and national pride. That alone was enough to shake those who believed Africa could still be managed. Quickly, the tone shifted behind closed doors in intelligence briefings and diplomatic messages. Burkina Faso wasn't just another unstable country dealing with coups and militants anymore. It had become something else, something more dangerous. An example. Proof that a young African military leader could rally his people by rejecting foreign influence completely, instead of trying to imitate it. It wasn't chaos that scared outsiders, it was the movement's clarity, because what starts in Ouagadougou doesn't stay in Ouagadougou. Embassies in nearby countries, Senegal, Niger, Togo, and Mali, filed quiet updates just days after the protests. Youth groups across the region were paying attention. Videos of Burkinabe crowds shouting "sovereignty or nothing" flooded social media. Anonymous websites popped up, offering live stream tips, protest planning guides, and community patrol playbooks. The Burkina model was spreading quickly, and that's what truly worried foreign powers. This wasn't just about one country turning its back, it was a continent remembering its history. A continent realizing that it never agreed to the Berlin Conference, that the CFA franc was never put to a vote. That security always came dressed in someone else's uniform. ECOWAS, once seen as a force for unity, now looked like a tool to protect the powerful. And France, in particular, was feeling the pressure. Behind closed doors, officials were reportedly calling Burkina Faso a breaking point, not because of military power, but because of something harder to control: attitude. The boldness of a former colony that didn't fear punishment. Captain Traoré's resistance wasn't a performance for diplomats. It was the choice of someone who understood the risks and made peace with them. That kind of leadership, when backed by the people, is what worried the most powerful. For France, it was a dilemma. Push back too hard, and you confirm every accusation of neocolonialism. But do nothing, and the movement grows even stronger. French media were quick to label the protests as either mob-driven or anti-democratic, hinting that they were tied to regional chaos or Russian interference. But the footage told a different story. The crowds waved nothing but Burkinabe flags, many of them handmade and attached to sticks. No foreign flags were in sight. The United States, as usual, took a cautious stance, making diplomatic statements urging peace and dialogue, while keeping one foot in and 1 foot out. European countries watched with concern, especially as military analysts began warning that the Sahel region might no longer be so easy to influence or control. Burkina Faso is more than just a small, landlocked country. It has rich gold reserves and a growing spirit of independence. It sits in a critical spot between North and West Africa, making it strategically important. At the same time, ECOWAS, a group once seen as a pillar of regional unity, was starting to look outdated and irrelevant. Once praised for promoting stability, it was now seen as a club for leaders more interested in staying in power than protecting their nation's freedom. For many young protesters, every chant against ECOWAS was another sign that the old system had lost its meaning. Built on weak agreements and outside influence, the organization seemed out of step with the people. What unsettled foreign governments the most wasn't the volume of the protests, it was their order. The people of Burkina Faso didn't set fires or loot stores. They offered first aid, handed out drinking water, and documented everything with discipline and purpose. This didn't look like a breakdown, it looked like the beginning of a new kind of nation. That's what truly worried outside observers. These protests weren't just emotional reactions, they were focused, calculated, and deeply rooted in a clear vision. At their heart was the dream of a self-reliant Africa built on the ideals of Thomas Sankara. The goal wasn't to patch up the old colonial systems, it was to tear them down and build something entirely new. Now the question is, will Western powers try to downplay what's happening? And even if they try, can they really stop the momentum? Let us know in the comments, do you think Africa is finally waking up? If you'd like to see more content like this, hit the bell icon and subscribe to our channel. Thanks for watching, and don't miss our next video.